So it seems that the long-suffered Legion of Mortarion are doomed to suffer some more. It seems that Games Workshop haven't been too kind in their latest faction preview for the Death Guard. Seems that disgusting resilience is gone, their faction rule is arguably toned down, and their detachment rule maybe doesn't really add much more than the faction rule in the first place. Let's talk about the new rules for the Death Guard. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where it seems to be a busy day in the world of 40k. We've got core rules leaks, and now right on schedule we've got Games Workshop's preview for the Death Guard, which as you can probably tell by the title and thumbnail, I feel like it is going to leave a fair few people disappointed. Looks like the rules are pretty much flatly toned down for them. Obviously at this stage I really wouldn't be getting too stressed about things. We can't tell whether factions are going to be strong or weak until we have the points cost, though I must admit based on first impressions it's not looking amazingly great. Here's a quick summary of the reveals that we've had today, and perhaps one of the most disappointing things is that it seems that Death Guard don't look like they've got any inbuilt durability mechanic anymore. Their toughness looks like it's just going to be represented by their base datasheets alone. They don't seem to have disgustingly resilient in terms of feel no pain or -1 damage. Both of those look like they're gone. We've seen 2 datasheets plus their army special rule. Unless there's any other surprises in store, it looks like the only thing that are making Death Guard tougher is their boosted toughness profiles now, as opposed to any other fancy special rules. I had guessed that the -1 damage might well be going away, seeing as we hadn't seen it yet in 10th edition, but looks like we don't have a feel no pain or any other massively meaningful increases in their other stats. It still looks like the standard issue Plague Marines will be toughness 5, and while Terminators have gone up to toughness 6, that's only really the same boost that the standard Space Marine ones got. Perhaps one of the other major themes in the army are plague weapons. As expected from things like the Nurgle weapons in the Demons preview, it does seem that these will be getting lethal hits now, so 6s to hit the target auto-wound them. Kinda weird that they're oddly good at killing tanks and vehicles now, as opposed to the flat wound rolls of 1 that they had, which were kind of equally effective against infantry and tanks. Does seem though that with that in play, Death Guard are going to be a faction that's very dangerous to vehicles once more. Seems that most of the armies in the game do have some easy way of getting access to lethal hits or some other anti-vehicle mechanic. Seems that their army-wide special rule is going to be Nurgle's Gift. This one is very similar to the old Contagions of Nurgle which they've had throughout 9th. Maybe a bit of a side grade there, and it works in some ways better, in some ways a bit worse. Limiting toughness though is just a little bit less good in 10th though I think, due to the amount of toughness values being stretched. Their core detachment on launch day is Plague Company, and it looks like their main rule is called Spread the Sickness, and I must admit this one looks a bit disappointing, at least compared with a lot of the other ones that we've seen. Looks like their rule gets them sticky objectives, so holding them if you move off them, plus the objectives providing Nurgle's Gift, which I feel like is going to be redundant in quite a lot of cases. Otherwise, we've got other previews for the Plagueburst Mortar's new profile, and a melee damage stratagem that's good on objectives, and a couple of useful new unit profiles to see, the Malignant Plaguecaster and the Blightlord Terminators. Before we jump into the rules, I would say that I'm a little bit unimpressed by them, but I'd bear in mind that they could still be very strong if Games Workshop have adjusted their points cost appropriately. So while looking at rules and comparing them with 9th edition might not look great, I'd definitely bear in mind that we don't have the full picture. Jumping into it though, and first up we have Nurgle's Gift. This is the new equivalent of the Contagions of Nurgle that they've had in 9th, basically an expanding aura of -1 toughness around every single model in the army. This version of it, you have a round 1 version where it's a 3-inch aura around all the units, round 2 it's going to be a 6-inch aura, and then round 3 it's going to be a 9-inch aura, covering really quite a lot of the board if your opponent gets anywhere near close to you. It really is a pretty handy debuff every time it does influence a wound roll. Say you could scoot something like a bloat drone up the board and put it in range of a unit, and then they're less tough to your shooting, and it's pretty much always going to be on whenever the enemy's in melee with you. They're just going to be that little bit easy to kill there. It's nice and simple and effective, and it's still really quite a helpful ability to have. The reason though that I think it's just a little bit less overwhelming in 10th edition though is because of how much the toughness chart has been stretched. You've now got vehicles going all the way up to toughness 14, where they're really not going to care too much if they go from toughness 14 to 13, or say a vehicle with toughness 12 going to toughness 11. It's not going to be relevant against that many weapon profiles. It's just a lot less of a deal compared with things like a toughness 8 vehicle going down to toughness 7 in current 9th edition. And it looks like there's a lot fewer things that are say toughness 8, so if you had any strength 8 weapons in your army, they're less likely to get benefits from this. Definitely not a bad rule, but I feel like it's going to be less meaningful than before. Often you'll just reduce the opponent's toughness, and it won't actually be relevant to the wound roll. It maybe is even doubled down on by the amount of lethal hits going around in the army. They're not even going to need the wound roll anyway, so this rule is meaningless for a lot of plague weapons when they hit on 6s. That rule still isn't bad though, but I feel like this Plague Company rule kind of is. If this is the entirety of the rule for the Death Guard detachment, I feel like it's perhaps one of the weakest ones that we've seen so far. The Plague Company's rule is called Spread the Sickness, and this basically gives you a couple of different abilities, sticky objectives, and then those objectives grant the gift of Nurgle. So if the enemy gets too close to them, then they potentially reduce their toughness. The sticky objective rule definitely isn't bad, it can have some use. It's basically most helpful if you've got a fast moving assault unit moving on. They can jump onto an objective, hold it in your command phase, and then go bounding off to take the fight to the enemy and not worry about the point provided the opponent isn't too close to it and able to move on to it. It's also particularly helpful against things like Battle Shock as well. Say for example, if you had some Plague Marines holding an objective, if they get shot down to less than half strength and fail a Battle Shock, you'll still have the objective if the opponent can't reach it. It's handy enough, but I feel like it's maybe less important to the Death Guard than most. Their units are generally really quite good at just stomping onto objectives and then holding them against all comers. I feel like their game plan is usually to put some super durable units on the objectives and then stay there and laugh off the enemy attacks. The extra gift range I think could be okay, but to be honest, if you've actually got a unit on the objective, it's going to be kind of redundant, as that unit will already be pushing out that aura anyway. So the objective having the same aura isn't going to give you any additional benefit. In 10th edition, as with 9th, multiple copies of the same aura don't stack, so it's not like you get to reduce the enemy unit's toughness by 2 or anything. Overall, as faction rules go, I think this one's pretty weak. It'll occasionally help you out against a battle shock, or maybe if you desperately need to take the fight to the enemy and abandon an objective. Most of the time though, this is barely going to see any use at all. Then we've got a couple of rules previews, the first one being the Sanguous Flux. This one's one of the Plague Company stratagems, and it looks kind of helpful enough. Basically a damage boost for units, particularly if they're holding objectives. You activate it in your fight phase when you're about to fight, and your Death Guard unit gets a damage boost, either sustained hits 1 on their weapons if they're not on an objective, but they get a big sustained hits 2 if they are on an objective. That's often going to account for a 50% damage boost to their normal attacks, really quite impressive there. Really, I think it's kind of passable if you're not on an objective, but if you are, it's really very good. This one looks really quite great for a big unit of Blightlord or Deathshroud Terminators, and I feel like it'll be really interesting to see if there's any way of getting full rerolls to hit in the army. It could be absolutely devastating with this stratagem. Potentially if you had a unit with this and they had full rerolls to hit, you could reroll everything that isn't a 6, try and fish for those double exploding 6s, and then also you might have a fair few weapons be plague weapons as well, so at least your first hit would count as a lethal hit as well. That would net you 1 auto wound on the enemy and 2 other regular hits, really very nasty for every roll of a 6 that you can muster. Even if that's not possible though, this still seems great for units fighting in combat on objectives. That's just going to happen quite a lot, as the objectives are the points that you need to fight over to win the game. Next up, we've got the Plagueburst Mortar, a pretty iconic Death Guard unit this. I feel like Plagueburst crawlers have been pretty much solid since they came out. This one's received a bit of a side grade, more shots but worse AP. Maybe it's taking a bit more of a profile that's more anti-infantry compared with anti-tank as well. Now, rather than getting just d6 shots, you get d6 plus 3. That means you've got an average of 6 or 7 shots out of the thing, as opposed to just 3 or 4. Really quite nice. I feel like the new blast rule will definitely be a big advantage to this as well. If you're targeting squads with 5 men in them, then you'll get an extra one, and even more against hordes. The AP on this thing though has taken a hit. Previously it was AP minus 2, and now it's AP minus 1. With the core indirect fire rules basically giving your target the benefit of cover, that will mean that for most targets that you're firing at, effectively this thing's going to be AP 0 unless you can actually see them. That really is going to hamper its damage output a fair bit. It's going to be far better against things with a save of 4+ or worse, really not so effective against Space Marines. And if you're fighting against Astartes, it might just be worth using this as a direct fire weapon, so you're not taking -1 to hits and losing AP. It's taken the side grade of losing the plague weapon reroll 1s to wound for the lethal hits. A lot of the time that's going to be better, particularly against vehicles as well. I feel like it's going to be nice against vehicles because the strength of 8 has stayed the same, but that's basically a big downgrade going into 10th edition. It will now be wounding just about every vehicle in the game on a 5+ rather than a 4 or better, so the lethal hits will help it punch up a bit against things like repulsors or land raiders. Finally, it's doubling down on being an anti-infantry weapon with its ability. Spore-laced shockwaves gives you a battle shock test on an infantry unit, always a nice thing to have, could really mess with the opponent if it stops them using stratagems and things. Overall, I feel like this has taken a bit more of a niche compared with what it had before, perhaps a little bit less general purpose against everything, but now it really quite excels against infantry, and I feel like perhaps a lot more of the time with the indirect fire rules, you might just want to use this as a direct fire weapon. It is going to significantly increase its damage output, and usually the Plagueburst crawlers tend to be tough enough to take a bit of enemy punishment anyway. Finally, we've got a couple of datasheets, the first one for the Blightlord Terminators, and these are the ones that we can see that there doesn't appear to be any feel no pain or -1 damage rule, disgusting resilience having gone away. The unit has been upgraded to a toughness 6, though I'd say that this maybe isn't unexpected really. It seems that the Loyalist Terminators have gone to toughness 5, these guys were toughness 5 already, so it certainly makes sense that they went up to toughness 6 here. It might not make the biggest difference against anti-tank weapons and things, which have also increased in strength, but it will be a big deal against things like heavy bolters, now wounding them on 5s. Otherwise they will still be fairly durable, 3 wounds at a 2+ save and a 4+ invul save, though without the -1 damage that they previously had, that will hurt a bit. I feel it is a bit unfortunate for them that they have one of the slowest movement characteristics in the entire game of 40k as well, just a 4-inch move now. Unless they have some sort of characters for making them a fair bit faster, then it seems like they've got a fair bit of potential for the opponent to kite them and keep away from them. Otherwise, for their weapon profiles, the main weapons have been consolidated into a standard sort of power weapon profile with lethal hits. The bubonic blades will be fairly general purpose with that, 4 attacks and auto wounds on 6s to hit, so they will still be a threat against vehicles with that amount of volume. The flail still seems very handy to have in the unit, only AP -1 but you get a big 6 attacks. It's still got damage 2 and it also gets the lethal hits, not at all bad for punching up, and of course still be pretty ruinous to 2 wound infantry. For the ranged weapons, we've got a special rule called Blistering Fusillade. This one allows the models to make a ranged attack against the closest enemy unit, and they get to re-roll a wound roll of 1 against them. A bit nothingy really, not a bad damage output increase, but then not exactly exceptional. I feel like this will be nice when it triggers, but it's probably not going to outweigh shooting them against their most optimal targets. For their ranged weapons, it looks like their combi bolters have now become Plague combi bolters, so they've got lethal hits there, very good for taking down tough stuff even if their AP is 0. Their Plague Spewer is rather brutal against infantry, auto-wounding them on a 2+ now, so that'll be fairly intense. The Reaper autocannon's an interesting generalist profile. It's only damage 1 compared with a lot of autocannons damage 3, but it gets double the shots of other autocannons that we've seen. Plus it also has sustained hits 1, so exploding 6s, plus also devastating wounds, so any wound roll of a 6 will grant a mortal wound. Feels like a weapon that's basically not going to be ineffective against anything that you're pointed against, but never really going to do it outstanding damage either. Finally, the Blight Launcher's somewhat similar to previous, just 2 shots at 24 inches, only AP -1 and damage 2 now. Finally, we've got the Malignant Plaguecaster. I had wondered whether they were going to show off Mortarion's profile, but it seems not. Seems that we'll have to wait for the big Primarch himself to surface later. The Plaguecaster's profile is perhaps fairly as expected, toughness 5, so heavily it implies that the Plague Marines will get that still. 4 wounds and he attacks with his corrupted staff, hitting at strength 6 and damage D3 with the lethal hits and psychic rule. As seems to be the case with a fair few of the mainline psychers, he's got basically 3 different psychic abilities, 1 damage dealer and then 2 useful buffing or debuffing things. His ranged smite equivalent is called Plague Wind. This one seems to be like quite a lot of other focused psychic profiles in 10th edition. You've got 2 different ways of firing it, either a basic profile or a hazardous one. The hazardous one giving you a massive damage increase, going up to strength 6 and AP -2 and D6 plus 3 shots. It also auto hits with the torrent rule as well, though I guess you are risking 3 mortal wounds out of it if you roll wrong. As we saw from the core rules leaks earlier, with the hazardous rule you have to roll a single d6, and if you get a 1 you take 3 mortal wounds on characters. Still though, that looks like a very solid shooting attack, kind of reminds me of the Foul Blight spawn a little bit in the current edition of Death Guard. I feel like this one is going to be genuinely worth rolling hazardous for. On top of this, it gets the Pestilent Fallout ability. Generally this is going to help out when you've shot a unit with your Plague Wind. This one means that if you hit an infantry unit with it, you get to debuff their movement and charge rolls, so -2 to move and advance, plus -2 to charges. It's only 12-inch range, so it might not stop a melee unit from catching up from the Plaguecaster himself, but that could still be really annoying for things like, say, a big Adeptus Custodes Terminator unit, or perhaps some fast-moving melee infantry that really want to get where they need to go and don't want to be messing around with an effective -4-inch movement if they're charging. Quite a nice little extra there. Finally, he's got a rule called Gift of Contagion. This one's one where you have to roll a 2+ to cast it, and if you roll a 1 then he takes some mortal wounds, basically from Perils of the Warp I suppose. This one targets 1 enemy unit, and they get -1 to wound when they attack in the fight phase. Basically makes them much worse in combat by a fairly significant margin, and you can hand that out all the way to 18 inches. Quite nice that it triggers in the shooting phase as well, so you get to move your Plaguecaster before you cast that. That means it's got quite a good effective threat range. I feel like the -1 to wound will be particularly painful into Death Guard and their very high toughness values. I feel like it is maybe a bit of a matchup dependent rule though. If your opponent is entirely gunliney and has very little melee, it's not going to matter very much, but on the right unit, if it does happen to come into play, it could be pretty big. Overall, Plaguecasters definitely look usable, I think. Maybe not auto-include, just from a look at this datasheet. I guess we'll have to weigh them up against the other HQ's choices when we find out what they do. Overall, I must admit, from a faction preview perspective, I think that this is one of the less exciting ones by quite a way. I feel like the contagions aren't really too bad, but that detachment rule is really quite underwhelming if nothing else goes with it. Let me know your thoughts though. Hopefully Games Workshop managed to keep things balanced with other things like strong datasheets and stratagems, but I do suspect that there'll be a fair few Death Guard players a bit disappointed with this. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.